Fantasy is a genre that captures the viewer's imagination and takes the viewer on a journey. Fantasy can show you worlds of magic and make-believe and show you images that only appear dreamlike, such as wizards, elves, witches and dragons. The fantasy genre was created for film roughly in the early 1900s with George Méliès's silent film Voyage dans la Lune, about a trip to the moon. Recent family films such as The Hobbit is a good example of a high-budget fantasy film. The amount of actors used, effects, locations, props and costumes put forward a display of fantasy on a larger scale and makes the fantasy film seem more realistic in a way. Themes in fantasy films are often about bravery, friendship, love, myths, overcoming perils and strength. Settings for fantasy films can range from space to the centre of the earth, but many are filmed in wide open spaces such as mountains, the desert, or around a castle. A lot of the costumes used are long robes, chainmail, capes and armour. The antagonist of the film, which is the bad guy, would often wear black clothing, and the good guy, which is the protagonist, would often wear light-coloured clothing, so this is easier to tell which is the good guy and which is the bad guy. Props used in fantasy films are often weapons such as swords, shields and axes. Other props may include enchanted books, candles, royal paintings, magical objects and bottles. Mise en scène is the French word for placing on stage. Here I did an interview with some students on their ideas of a fantasy film. First thing you think about when you think of a fantasy film?
Fairy. Magic.
Vampires.
Werewolves.
So what do you think a fantasy film is?
Pretty much anything which is not a place in reality. It can't really be real, most likely won't be invented, otherwise that would be going off genre.
Such as like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, with little, is it elves, is it?
There's elves and
hobbits,
orcs and
yeah.
Dragons.
Dragons, yeah, and then got magic.
What do you think goes into making a good fantasy film?
good answer.
A good storyline?
Good director.
Rather large amounts of CGI.
There are many quotes on the matter of fantasy. Dr. Seuss says, "I like nonsense. It wakes up the brain cells. Fantasy is a necessary ingredient in living." And Albert Einstein has said, "The gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my talent for absorbing positive knowledge."
So in conclusion, fantasy is a genre that takes things of our imagination and uses them in ways many generations enjoy.